well, we'll certainly welcome other folks that join us in progress, but want to make sure we use your time well because we have an action-packed agenda with lots of great speakers. So first, let me introduce myself. I am Susan Gaffney, the Executive Vice President at the National Health Council. And today is our biosimilars briefing, and we're thrilled to have you all join us for what promises to be great content. So if you're not already familiar with us, well, first let me say welcome to our members, many of whom I know are joining us today. But for those of you who may not already be familiar with the National Health Council, we have the mission of providing a united voice for the 160 million people in the United States living with chronic diseases and disabilities and their family caregivers. So we really, we bring together diverse stakeholders to drive patient-focused health policy. We've been doing that for a long time, and we have over 150 mission-aligned organizations in membership that we do that with. If you have any interest in what we do and how you might be part of that, we welcome any inquiries at the information here on the slide. So before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping things. The webinar is being recorded and it will be distributed to attendees afterwards. And everyone except the speakers will be muted. If you have any questions, go ahead and put those in the Q&A portal here on the Zoom. And if you have any comments that you just want to share for others to read, you can put that in the chat function. The closed captioning feature is available for this event. So to turn that on, please go to the navigation menu and select Show Captions, then select your preferred language and select OK. If you have any technical questions about the Zoom or any of that kind of stuff, you can go ahead and email nhcmeetings@nhcouncil.org. So the speaker slides, which are many here today, we have such great expertise on the call. I was admiring the depth and breadth of the information in the slides that we'll see. Those slides will be available and additional resources following to all the participants. And so for the next hour, you can expect to listen and learn, and we really encourage you to participate, share ideas, best practices, and your own strategic thinking on these matters. And please don't hesitate to participate in both the chat function and the Q&A function. We will pause speakers to bring questions to them live during the presentations, just to keep it really as interactive as possible. So no need to hold on to your questions till the end. We'll be happy to take them as they come in as best we can. And we also have time saved at the end for a more broad-based discussion. So let's quick go over the agenda, and then I'll be happy to introduce the first speaker. So we'll start with an overview to make sure that we're all sort of grounded and in the same place, and with a focus on resources and opportunities. Then more about the current landscape and the market barriers to access, which I think is very much a unifying interest of the folks gathered here today, and what's needed to better ensure patient communities can most benefit from biosimilars. And then we'll jump into a data-driven discussion on the value and what it really offers to patients and to the system. So lots of really compelling information and opportunities for discussion and questions. And with that, I will jump right into content because I know that's why you're here. So allow me to introduce Sarah Eikenberry from the FDA. She's a senior communication advisor for the Office of Therapeutic Biologics and Biosimilars in the Center for Evaluation and Research at the FDA. She provides communication advice and support to senior leaders in the agency about communicating strategic priorities, initiatives, and educational information about biosimilar and interchangeable products. She also manages stakeholder education and outreach activities related to biosimilars for the agency. And I'm delighted to welcome her to kick off this conversation today. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Susan. I appreciate the warm welcome, and thank you everyone for joining us today and for the opportunity to speak to you about biosimilar treatment options. Next slide. So I'm going to go over a little bit of background information about what biosimilars are and a little bit about how FDA reviews and approves them. Next slide, please. So biosimilars are biological products, and to understand more about the approval pathway and why it is, say, different than generics, it helps to know that biologics are made in or from living sources like animal cells and microorganisms like bacteria or yeast. And so while they are bigger than a typical clinical medication like aspirin, they do range in size and complexity, with shown here like insulin being relatively small and not as complex, up to a monoclonal antibody, which is large and fairly complex. And so the monoclonal antibody examples that you've probably heard of are infliximab or Remicade, trastuzumab, which is Herceptin, or adalimumab, which is Humira. So because most biologics are made from living sources, it is normal for both the biosimilar and the reference product, or sometimes we call them original biologics for patients, but to have minor differences between the same batches of medications. Next slide. So this slide outlines the key definitions that is provided in the law that governs biosimilars, which is the BPCI Act. So a reference product is the biological product already approved by FDA against which the proposed biosimilar is compared. A biosimilar product needs to meet two key standards. It's got to be highly similar to and have no clinically meaningful difference from a reference product. And then an interchangeable is a biosimilar, so it meets the two standards noted for biosimilars. And then there's some additional regulatory language about them, that it's expected to produce the same clinical result and not increase safety or decrease effectiveness. But this is mostly relevant for pharmacy substitution, and I will definitely go more into information about interchangeables in a couple of slides. Next slide, please. So this slide shows a comparison of biosimilar and biologic and biosimilars, and talks about a little bit of the variation here. And so should you be worried that biosimilars are not identical to the reference biologic? And the short answer is no. Because most biologics are made from living sources, as discussed, it's normal and expected for these products to have minor differences between batches of the same medication. And this is true of whether it's a biosimilar or whether it's a reference biologic. And so that's why we call them biosimilars. And the approval process is extremely rigorous, and as part of the process, FDA reviews any differences between the original or reference biologic and the biosimilar to ensure that they match the same variations that the original biologic has. And that means that they'll provide the same treatment benefits and risks as the original biologic it was compared to. Next slide, please.
So Sarah, Sonia Lee raised her hand with a question. Sonia, do you want to open your mic and ask your question? All right, Sonia, if you want to open your mic and ask your question, go ahead, or else we'll... Oh, it was an accident. Sorry, Sarah, keep going.
No worries. No worries. So this next slide, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on it. And it's the different goals for development of what we call standalone product, or 351A BLA. So this would be the reference product with it, what that has to go through, and then biosimilar development and the abbreviated 351K pathway. And so there's completely different goals, because for a standalone product, the goal is to establish from scratch the safety and efficacy of the new product. And that data package is largely based on those big pivotal clinical trials, which is represented by that larger top blue portion of the square on the left, the clinical safety and efficacy study for each indication. And so it has to be done for each indication that the product is approved for. For biosimilars, they meet standards by a different set of studies because the goals are different. The goal is to show that the biosimilar is highly similar to the reference product. And so what happens is that the biggest portion is not that clinical portion, but it's the comparative analytical assessments. And the comparative analytical assessment is very rigorous and makes up the foundation. And it's because analytical studies are generally more sensitive than clinical studies in detecting differences should they exist. So a product that's highly similar with respect to structure and function, and that's what they're looking at, to the reference product should behave like the reference product clinically. And so there's some types of clinical assessments that are also used to demonstrate that there are no clinically meaningful differences. Sometimes PK to be compared between the biosimilar and the reference product, and that's pharmacokinetics. And in some cases, studies of patients to compare efficacy, safety, and immunogenicity, but they're not considered, as large as these large clinical trials as it would be for the standalone product. But I want to point out one important aspect here is that the quality aspect is exactly the same. There's no abbreviations. The same laws and science applies to both the reference and the biosimilar product. It's just a little bit of a different way of evaluating them. Next slide. So I'm going to take you back to interchangeable products now. And an interchangeable is a biosimilar that may be substituted without consulting the prescriber because it meets additional requirements related to the potential for automatic substitution. And that's subject to state laws. So generally, in addition to the data to support biosimilarity, an interchangeable biosimilar undergoes some additional scientific evidence or scientific evaluation to support automatic substitution at the pharmacy. So in some cases, a study may be conducted to show that switching between the two products is no different than using the reference product without switching. However, I would like to point out that there are 4 approved interchangeable biosimilars, and 3 of the 4 were able to scientifically justify not needing a switching study. Next slide. So why seek interchangeability? Because scientifically and clinically, nothing is different. Biosimilar and interchangeable biosimilars both must meet FDA's requirements for showing that they are highly similar to and have no clinically meaningful differences from the reference product. But the law that governs biosimilars states that if a biosimilar is automatically substituted at the pharmacy, it has to be determined to be an interchangeable biosimilar. But a company has to apply specifically to be evaluated as an interchangeable. And there are many reasons why a company may not seek that status, such as business reasons. And in fact, many manufacturers do not seek that interchangeability because it is only relevant to pharmacy substitution. Most of the medications that are biologics and that have approved biosimilars are administered at like a hospital or outpatient clinic, and you couldn't even get it at your local pharmacy anyways. And so that may make you wonder if you should wait for a biosimilar to be approved as an interchangeable to use it. And no, you do not have to wait for that. They both meet the same high standards of biosimilarity for FDA approval, and both are as safe and effective as the reference product they were compared to.
So Sarah, we have a question from Savine Alexander asking, what is the scientific basis for justification of which biosimilar needs interchangeability trials and which don't?
So there's different factors depending on the product. So it's not a one size fits all approach. However, with insulins, there is a guidance to support the fact that you don't really need clinical immunogenicity studies. And so immunogenicity are those like safety studies that we're talking about here. And that is because there's a huge body of evidence to show that even if insulins produce immunogenicity, it doesn't actually clinically affect people. And so there's not really a need to be worried about it. And insulins have been used, for like 100 years. So there wasn't a scientific need. And the other product that was determined to be interchangeable without the need for an immunogenicity study was ranibizumab biosimilar, and that is injected into the eyeball, and so it's used for macular degeneration. And the rationale there being that, that's like kind of a closed system and it's not being distributed throughout your body. And so they were able to scientifically justify why there wasn't a need to have that scientific extra study. Okay. All right, well, the next slide. I'm just going to go a little bit into how biosimilars are like generics. A lot of people, are very familiar with the generic pathway and sort of the generic framework. And so it is helpful to kind of understand biosimilars in that context sometimes. And so biosimilars are like generics in some ways, in that they both are compared to original or like a brand product for approval. And they're both versions of previously FDA approved medications that the goals are to offer more affordable treatment options and start market competition and all of these things. But they're approved through different regulatory approval pathways. And so that's definitely one of the differences. But the goals there are that they both avoid those duplicating those costly, clinical trials. They both do go through, rigorous review processes, but there's differences. The biosimilar process, it does require a lot more data to be submitted in order to, do that analytical testing and all of that. It's a little different than the the testing that the generics go through with the bioequivalence. And that's because the chemical ingredients can be more easily copied, where the natural living sources cannot be exactly copied, like we talked about with the variability. So the information that needs to demonstrate that the biologic is biosimilar can be more extensive. But they definitely, you know, are similar in their goals. Okay, and the next slide. I won't go over this because I believe Carolyn will, and but this is just a snapshot of all the approved biosimilars and interchangeables approved to date in the US, and that we have 41 approved products to 11 different reference products, and around 29 are marketed. You know, that changes and we don't formally track that, or officially track it, I should say. So we might not oftentimes have the most up-to-date information about what's on the market. So I'm sure you'll hear more about that later. And so I'm running close to time. I've got several more slides, but I'm going to roll quickly through them. Next slide. And go through sort of our education and outreach materials. And this just kind of highlights that this is a very big goal for FDA. It's in our biosimilars action plan. But we, you know, to develop effective communications, to improve to improve understanding of biosimilars among multiple different audiences, patients, healthcare providers, payers, and you know, stakeholder education is a huge part of that for us, because we know that people aren't necessarily coming to FDA's website to find this information. And so it's really great that we have opportunities like this to come out and talk to people so that we can showcase the different materials we have available for you to use. So on the following slide is a snapshot of our healthcare provider materials and the fact sheets that we have on our website available, in addition to infographics and some other things. And the next slide shows the videos that we just released last week. We have 3 new videos, sort of an overview one on the review and approval process, and then one specific to interchangeability. Next slide. We have a lot of different patient materials available, including fact sheets, infographics, and articles. And on the next slide, we show the content available in Spanish. The following slide, we have our curriculum toolkit. And this is a pretty comprehensive resource on biosimilars that was designed to help educate students in healthcare professional degree programs like medicine, nursing, physician associate, pharmacy, et cetera. And so this toolkit has a variety of educational resources to help understand, apply, and teach concepts related to biosimilars. And so that includes like slides, discussion questions, case studies, and more that can be, you know, mix and matched and just used as needed. Next slide. We have 4 continuing education courses released through Medscape to enhance understanding of biosimilars that are available to, you know, for free. Next slide. We work with other stakeholders like USP, the United States Pharmacopoeia, and FTC to put together fact sheets to reach additional audience members. And then the next 2 slides are the Purple Book. And so the Purple Book database is an online search engine with information about FDA licensed biological products. So this is where you can go if you want to look up information about any approved biologic product, including allergenic, cellular, gene therapy, blood, and vaccine products. And so the next slide, yep, you got it there. It shows the different features. There's simple and advanced searches, glossaries, FAQs, information that can help you use this to the fullest extent. And then we, on the next slide, you know, we are always working on materials, so more will be coming. We have plans to release a video for patients in the future, the short future, hopefully this summer. And then I just want to thank you for your time and take it over to Susan to introduce the other speakers.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was a great sort of grounding in biosimilars, as well as all those resources. I know we will be checking those out at the National Health Council, and I'm sure many of you will as well. I know patients are keenly interested in the new things that are happening in this space, and it serves all of us well to be well grounded in it. So I'm really pleased to continue this conversation with the next 3 presenters who have just deep knowledge that are going to help round out what Sarah has already taken us through. So I'll do some quick intros. First, you'll hear from Julie Reed, the Executive Director of the Biosimilars Forum. Julie served as the Biosimilars Forum President for more than 8 years and was one of its original co-founders. She brings more than 30 years of experience in the healthcare sector to the forum and has served in executive roles leading global corporate and government affairs for Pfizer, Hospira, and Coherus Biosciences. Following Julie, you'll hear from Anna Hyde, Vice President of Advocacy and Access at the Arthritis Foundation, one of our NHC members. Anna is the Vice President of Advocacy and Access for the foundation, where she oversees both the federal and state legislative programs, in addition to grassroots engagement. Her focus is to raise the visibility of arthritis as a public health priority, build support for federal and state legislation that ensures access to affordable, high-quality healthcare, and enhance patient engagement in the policymaking process. Rounding out the discussion, we're pleased to have Amanda Fories. I hope I got that right, Amanda. And she is a partner at Magnolia Market Access. Amanda's consulting and manufacturer experience has covered a wide range of commercialization topics, including health policy, pricing and rebating, coding, coverage, and reimbursement, and health economics, among many. So thank you all for being here, and I will ask Julie to kick us off.
Thank you, Susan, and thanks everybody in NHC for sponsoring this great workshop. And there's nothing more exciting to me than to talk about biosimilars, but I know I have a lot of slides that Mary, I'm going to make you go through some of them pretty quickly so we get through our timing. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And this is just a background. So the Biosimilars Forum, just so you all know, it's the trade association that singularly represents the biosimilars industry in the United States. And our members represent the manufacturers who have the largest number of biosimilars, not just on the market in the US and in development in the US, but actually on the market around the world. And our members have experience over a decade of experience in biosimilars, and have actually launched biosimilars in over 80 countries around the world. So we have a considerable depth of experience with biosimilars. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. We can skip that one. I think it's very important that you already heard from the FDA about what a biosimilar is. But really, I think when we started lobbying years ago to get the biosimilar FDA program started and get the ability to have the FDA authorize and approve a biosimilar, it was because what we wanted to do was increase access to these medicines and provide lower cost options and support free market competitive opportunities in a market that had no competition. And what happens when you do that is the people that benefit from this are patients who need competition, need lower cost medicines, and deserve them. And but also, in a very critical piece of this, as Sarah said, is education. And we continuously, as the forum, as a trade association, work with the FDA and groups like the Arthritis Foundation to educate patient groups and physician groups constantly about what a biosimilar is. So next slide, please. I think what is important, as I discussed, is the biosimilars have an incredible savings opportunity because they are bringing in lower cost options, increasing access, and providing free market competition, which is so important in the pharmaceutical industry. Just in the next 2 years, and I'll talk about the Humira moment, there's an opportunity to save over $133 billion by 2025. I think it's an important note to note that biologic medicines represent only 2% of the prescriptions that are written, but 40% of the cost overall of prescription drugs in this country. And when biosimilars are entering the market because of the competition, we've seen prices for the reference or the brand product drop by 50% or more. So the market is working when there is competition and when the biosimilar has access to it. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we've been studying this for quite some time, and we know that if there was not competition introduced to the brand product or the brand biologic would continue to increase its price. But because biosimilar competition has been introduced to the market, we are seeing not only that in many cases the brand biologic will lower its price to compete, but the competition across biosimilars demonstrates lowering cost and lowering prices, which is absolutely wonderful for patients and their families and the employers who are paying the bill. Next slide, please. What's going to happen here in 2023 and literally in about 3 to 4 weeks in July? This was the watershed moment, the make it or break it moment for biosimilars in this country. We have an incredible opportunity with 8 to 9 Humira biosimilars launching July 1st. And we're also seeing an evolution of the market where we have a decade of experience and we can see streamlined development, getting biosimilars to the market faster. We have the Inflation Reduction Act being implemented. We have employers who are highly engaged in wanting to see lower prescription drug costs and see biosimilar competition. But also in Washington, there's a lot of discussion and scrutiny on pharmacy benefit managers. All of these things will have an incredible impact on biosimilars this next year. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, there's at least 8 biosimilar Humiras launching in the next month. When Humira has had close to 500% in price increase since it was first introduced with no competition, it's costing $84,000 or more per patients to obtain Humira. This is an incredible watershed moment for patients and families to have cost savings for the #1 selling drug in the world. Next slide, please. We know, as I mentioned, that the cost savings, just Medicare alone would have saved $2 to $5 billion. Humira's had no competition, so they've been able to increase their price. And we also know that there would be decreased spending with this competition from the Humira biosimilars. Next slide. The question and what's happening is what happens for biosimilars to gain access to the marketplace. And there's 3 PBMs, pharmacy benefit managers, that control 80% of the patient access to medicines in the United States. And what is happening is, unfortunately, the pharmacy benefit managers model is one that supports and prefers high cost products versus low cost biosimilars. And what we are seeing in the biosimilars marketplace is that when a biosimilar manufacturer wants to launch a biosimilar at a low list price, because that is our philosophy, is we're bringing in lower cost products. We want to offer you a lower cost product. We don't gain access to the market. The PBMs are pushing back and saying, you are not giving us a high enough rebate, and therefore we will not give you access to the market. And we have seen that the first biosimilar Humira, Amjevita, from Amgen, was launched at 2 prices. One with a 55% discount and one with a 5% discount. The same happened in the insulin market. The biosimilar insulin Semglee had to do the same thing, where they launched at a high WAC or high list price with almost no discount, and one at a low price with a high discount. Let me talk about what's happening in the marketplace because of that. Go ahead, next slide, please. If you look at it, because of the need to offer a high rebate and therefore a high list or WAC price, in order to gain access on the PBM formulary, this is causing that patients who have access only to the high list price have high out-of-pocket costs. They're not getting a low out-of-pocket cost because the PBMs are not giving them patients access to the low list price or low WAC, highly discounted product. That's very unfortunate for patients. And again, employers or the government, whoever is subsidizing that benefit. You're not getting the advantage of having access to a lower cost product, because that's not what the PBMs are allowing to have access to the market. We've had a member company actually go to, because of their belief in that patients should always have access to the lowest cost product. They're working with Mark Cuban's Cost Plus Pharmacy in order to provide their product into the marketplace and gain access, because they can't gain access at a PBM level. So we're seeing a change and a shift in the pricing, but also in the ability to have access to the marketplace for biosimilars because of PBM barriers. Next slide, please. So again, as I mentioned, we are very concerned. You have opportunities in the next month for 8 to 9 Humira biosimilars to launch. We have heard from the PBM starting a year ago that they're only going to allow 2 to 3 of those Humira biosimilars to have access to the entire market. So they are limiting cost savings, patient access to lower priced products, and they're limiting competition. We're seeing that companies have to provide a high WAC versus a low cost product in order to gain access. That is opposite of what we're trying to do, but that is what we are being forced to do. And again, the competition and the cost savings is going to be limited because of the behaviors of the PBMs. Next slide, please. So, and we can go, one of the key things we're saying is this is not fair to patients. It's also not fair to the industry who is trying to promote free market access and free market competition as a way to lower drug costs in this country. Go ahead, next slide. And then actually, let's go back to we'll skip this slide and just go back one real quick. So what we're looking for, and again, I think it's important to this entire group to understand, is that when there's 3 PBMs controlling the market and limiting patients' access to lower cost products or limiting free market competition, it's not only are the patients and the employers and the government not realizing the cost savings from a biosimilar developer perspective. If we can't have access, we're bringing these products to have access and lower cost competition. It's really going to consider whether or not this industry is going to be able to continue when we have no access to the market. I'll stop there, and I just want to again say thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you, Julie. That was really thought-provoking. I know I have questions. I'm sure other people do too, but let's go ahead and hear from Anna from the Arthritis Foundation, and I'd love your perspective on these issues.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Glad to be with you today. I'm not going to have slides. I'm just going to sort of speak to some of the work that we've done around preparing our patients for the entrance of the adalimumab biosimilars into the market this year. So with arthritis, there are a number of forms of arthritis for which biosimilars are available now. And so this is something that's been near and dear to us for a very long time. I've been with the foundation since 2014, right before the first biosimilars were approved, and have been following, of course, the trajectory ever since. It's been really interesting because when we first started to educate patients about biosimilars was right after the first, in our therapeutic area, it was infliximab, the reference product being Remicade, and then the biosimilars for that being approved and then coming to market first. And so we started to do some webinars and some different kind of basic educational opportunities for patients. And it was really clear that, biosimilars was just not a term that patients were really terribly familiar with. I think that's still true largely today. It may be different in other therapeutic areas. Certainly oncology, I think, has gotten a little further than we have in terms of just market uptake and availability of biosimilars. But it's just not a term or a concept that is just really readily known among the patient community, unless we're working with patients who are very plugged into us. They're on our newsletters or active in committees and things like that, in which they're hearing about the policy, right? So I think that's something that's really important to keep in mind, because we've done a number of, especially in the past year, really ramping up our efforts, knowing that 2023 was going to be a little bit of a watershed year. I think, the reference product of adalimumab Humira is the top selling drug in the world. So obviously the potential patient impact is large. And so we wanted to understand, where are patients coming from right now? Like, sort of what is their base knowledge level, and kind of what kinds of questions or concerns might they have about this moment in time. And so we did some surveys, we did some focus groups, and we have since done a lot of different types of educational activities, from podcasts to webinars, fireside chats, you name it, we've done it. So, and we really wanted all of our educational content to be informed by what patients told us. So, getting into it a little bit, our survey results were really interesting to me. There were some things that were not surprising, but some things that really were. And then backing up some of what we heard through focus groups was really eye-opening to me. So it was clear that, we asked familiarity about certain terms like reference product. Familiarity was incredibly low. The term biologic, is one that people are generally familiar with. And then biosimilar, some people, some familiarity, but still not a ton. But reference product, really not much. So for us, what that means is, as we're thinking about translating all of these terms into lay language, we need to keep that in mind. And that's something that we now include in our advocacy to other stakeholders about how best to communicate with patients. Do not assume that people understand these terms, right? So if you're going to use the term reference product, which by the way we do because it's kind of an industry standard, define what that means, right? Or give an example. So that was something that really informed kind of just basic educational levels. In terms of, I thought this was really interesting in terms of, people's use or comfort level. There were not many people who responded to our survey saying that they are currently using biosimilars, which makes sense. There isn't a whole lot of availability quite yet. And certainly when we did this survey last year, it was very limited just to the medical benefit side. But 85% of those that we surveyed said they would want to know if they were receiving a biosimilar in place of their biologic. So again, that sort of speaks to what I think any representative on this webinar of a patient group already knows, which is patients want to be a meaningful stakeholder in what is happening in their treatment. Those with chronic diseases like arthritis, they're very savvy about having to navigate the healthcare system and their treatment, because it is a chronic disease that they live with their whole lives. And many of the patients that we interact with a lot have been living with it for decades, and so they want to be treated as a meaningful, kind of respected partner in the healthcare decisions. So we think that's really important, particularly for PBMs, health plans, and others who are really making a lot of the decisions about formularies and how patients are going to sort of hear about what their options are, right? And so a lot of what we're doing now is putting forth really specific recommendations about, how you may approach your communications with patients. So, another kind of key finding to me was how important education is, because, what we've heard from a lot of patients is kind of a fear factor. The concept of changing to a different medication, even if it is therapeutically the same, is really daunting emotionally to a patient who spent a long time trying to find a treatment that was going to work for them. In autoimmune disease, it can be incredibly difficult to find, a treatment. Oftentimes the first one doesn't work and you're trying 2 or 3. It's a whole process. You may be experiencing worsening of disease in the meantime. And so when you find a drug that works for you, you really want to hang on to it. And what we have found in some of our focus groups is, when we say, you know, saying if we tell you these are you know, there's no clinically meaningful difference, they're safe and you know, effective, they're you know, data suggests that there aren't really safety concerns or anything like that. Sort of what is your thinking there? What's the value proposition to you as a patient? And what we've heard back often is there is no value proposition. I don't want to change my medication. I'm on my miracle drug and I don't want to change. So I think that was really eye-opening to me, and really illuminates how important education is, because in the survey, what we found was that 67% of respondents said they would be open to using a biosimilar if they had more information. But right now, with what they know, only 23% said they would be comfortable. So I thought that was really important. I wasn't surprised by that necessarily, but I think that gap I was a little surprised by. And so because of that, and taken together with some of the other findings that we talk about, what types of information patients want, certainly safety data, they want to know whatever real world data does exist, and certainly other countries that already have biosimilars on market, in instances like what we have in our therapeutic area, where we don't quite have that data yet in the US. That kind of information is helpful, sort of peer-to-peer. What did patients like me in this scenario, how did they do if they made a transition, that kind of thing. And they want to hear from their healthcare providers. So that was a whole other series of questions that we asked about. Where do you want to find information? Where do you go now? Really, the gold standard is I want to be able to have a conversation with my provider in the live, in the provider's office, where I can ask all the questions that I have, and I can really understand, okay, let's start with the safety and efficacy data. And I kind of want to understand and get comfortable there first, right? And then from there, it's how is this going to change my life? Is there manufacturer assistance available? For those who rely on that, that is a key question. It's one of the first ones that is going to come up. Is the injection device different? Is there going to be a different sort of out-of-pocket cost? Am I going to have to go through prior auth and step therapy and all those things? Just the practical day-to-day, how this impacts my life type of questions are really important. So we took all of that and we turned it into a set of kind of educational activities. We created a landing page on our website where we could just house everything. So we have a position statement that has specific sections for every stakeholder in the system, including the patient. We have webinar recordings, we have podcast recordings, and we have FAQs that really detail, these were the top questions that patients asked in our survey and in our focus groups. Let's put these in writing and really just have them available. That way, we can include them in newsletters and point people to them, and also, create what we hope is going to be a long-lasting feedback loop with different stakeholders so that we can be really tailored, because we believe stakeholder has a different responsibility here. Pharmacist has a unique responsibility to the patient, especially if there's an interchangeable biologic, right, or a biosimilar. Healthcare providers, of course, have a huge responsibility, being that trusted and most continuous source of information, that a patient is going to turn to. How a provider presents the information and how they feel, their confidence, comfort around prescribing a biosimilar is going to really dictate how a patient feels about taking the biosimilar. And then, of course, health plans as well. Like I said before, who are at the front lines, of course, of making formulary decisions. There's a whole kind of set of recommendations we have there. We certainly want patients to have access to biosimilars on their formulary at a safe cost savings to them. And so we're really eager, just like everybody else, to kind of see over the next few months, as more adalimumab biosimilars come to market, how the market responds, and what that access really looks like to patients, so that we can then kind of tailor both our, just policy positions, but then also how we communicate with patients. Because if we're going to be communicating with patients about, hey, by the way, there are these new treatment options for you may want to look into, we want to also then be able to say, this is what it's looking like. This is the likelihood that you may have access to a biosimilar. That was the core question that came up a lot. What is if I am on Humira now, what is the likelihood that I am going to be required to transition to a biosimilar, right? And we want to be able to answer that question, but it's difficult. I mean, the answer really is you're going to have to ask your health plan or your PBM, right? But we want to be able to give them as much up-to-date information as possible. So that's where we're going to continue our efforts, especially in the next few months, and continuing to gather data from our patients, especially those who are making the transition to biosimilars, so that we can capture kind of what was your experience like, what was the communication? What was the pathway to you transitioning to the biosimilar? What could have been done better? What was done really well, so that we can turn that into a set of really well-informed best practices. We certainly welcome partnership with anyone, and I'm happy to share any of the things that we've done for anyone who may be watching this, who's interested in doing some patient education in your therapeutic area or for your group, and you don't want to start from the beginning. I would be happy to share our playbook with you. So I think maybe that's a good place to stop, and happy to answer questions from there.
Thank you so much. And I feel like you really touched on the critical thing here, right? Is what is the patient experience going to be? How does this affect their lives? And what does that mean for the work that all the rest of us have to do to smooth that pathway and help patients ensure that they're getting what they need and that they feel comfortable and confident in what they need. So thank you. I know I'll be checking out your resources. I'm sure others will too. And before we get to Amanda, who will really, I think, bridge a lot of these topics with all these market issues, which have been brought up by all the presenters. There's a question from Guy Aiken for Julie. Is there any sense of how biosimilars will be chosen to be listed by PBMs? Is it explicitly cost-based or first to market? Are there other criteria? So Julie, if you could give us a little bit on that before we transition to Amanda.
Sure, and no, I personally don't have any sense. I think what we have seen is, the PBMs getting out in front of this late last year in the second and third, or the third and fourth quarters, publicly announcing they'll put 2 to 3 of the 8 to 9 biosimilar Humiras on formulary. So they were, messaging early on. As far as we have heard that it's based on the highest rebate. We're following the Amjevita launch. I can tell you that, and our next speaker is going to talk to this. So I'm going to let Amanda talk to that. She'll tell you exactly what is going on. And I think Amanda can give you insights too, based on her incredible experience. Let me have Amanda answer that question, because she's the one who tells me.
That's okay? A fair toss, Julie.
That
I think.
Woman, yeah, let's have the expert tell you the facts.
So great, Amanda.
No pressure at all. No pressure.
Amanda has all the answers, but
she does. She does.
But I do encourage you. We are approaching time too, so please put your questions in the chat. Anything that you have. And then if we don't have time to answer them live, we will do what we can to sort of follow up for the group. So Amanda, please take us through. I know we're all interested to hear more about market access.
Yeah, and I can definitely put an answer to that question in as well. I'm going to just talk a little back on the future of what's happened with biosimilars that have launched, because we've seen things on the medical side or the Medicare Part B side, and just even a little context of what the biosimilar world has done, and then talk a little bit about, as we've been talking about, the Humira and Amjevita launches. So we can just go to the next slide, please. So this is a very busy slide, and the only reason I have it this detailed is because I know you all can get these afterward, and I wanted you to be able to have the details. But the bottom right is really the point that I want to drive home with all of these things. Essentially, when a biosimilar comes to market, as Julie mentioned earlier, the price changes for the reference products. And well, not in all cases, but in most cases it does. And where you've seen that drop, you have seen patients effectively, if the reference product still has a price that's competitive with biosimilars, you've seen shift to the biosimilars, but you've also seen you stay with the reference product. So what that's telling us is price competition has been promoted, and overall, whether or not a patient goes on the reference or the biosimilar product, they are now on an effectively cheaper product, which is what we're hoping to see, right, with the cost savings in the system. Where you haven't seen that price competition and you've seen reference products keep their price higher and not compete and drop their price when a biosimilar has come to market, they have taken a huge hit on their overall utilization to the lower cost product. So the system itself is really shifting toward people wanting, obviously, to have a less expensive medication. But as we get into what's going on the Part D side, which is much more, as Julie had mentioned, kind of managed by the PBM world and the way that they're covering products, and that gets to the question that was just asked, things will be a little bit different. So let's go to the next slide. So this right here just kind of highlights a little bit of that point of what I was discussing a second ago. So as you can see, where and on the right, we have an example with some of the products that really drop their price, and you just see the number of claims tanking. These were the products that did not necessarily compete, right? They did not come out and compete on the price. So you saw instantly utilization go down. You see the utilization for the other products on the market taking up, and eventually everything's kind of leveled out. So this is kind of that group at the bottom, the major four. So they have had the most of loss in terms of utilization. Remicade and Neulasta on the list, those products have competed on price, but not as aggressively. So because of that, they've been able to kind of keep where they're at, right, and hold that share. So the other point I wanted to make here is Avastin. So Avastin is a product that has not had a huge amount of loss given its switch over to having biosimilars. And the reason is not necessarily what you would think. It's actually the off-label use. So off-label use for that product is what's really driving its consistent utilization, where just doctors in those other areas have not necessarily grasped onto the biosimilar yet. So that's why it's holding its share and has had minimal loss. Next slide, please. Here again, you can just kind of see you've got the WACs, and I think this highlights a little bit of that question that just came up. A WAC is obviously your list price or your price for your drug that everyone's seeing, but your average sales price is what you're submitting to the government that is net of all of the discounts that you give. And if you look here, you see that these products, the biosimilar, the reference product, have all had a pretty consistent WAC, but they have started to compete on price on that back end with all the price concessions that they give. And that's what tanks their ASP, and the ASP drops. And, there's the whole concept of the race to the bottom of what happens when more and more products come to market and they start competing on price, that you get to kind of to that lower bottom price for a product. So theoretically, this is a great look for the market, right? That you're seeing that competition, but the fact that that's happening on the back end, right, is where it's all going down. And I think this hits that question that was just asked about Humira. Is a provider or a insurance company, you're going to see this drug come out, they're going to evaluate, is it going to be first to market, is it going to be next, second, third, fourth, fifth? I think the answer is a little bit of both. I think at the end of the day, PBMs are saying we want to look at what net price is. So we see the price of these drugs, where's the contract, where are we going to make our money? So that's where you get a lot of that discussion on net price. To them is very important, but they may pick the first one to start just because they got something on formulary. I think that's, you're going to see Amjevita picked up probably quicker than some of the products that are launching July 1st to start. But eventually that competition in terms of the rebating side and where the net prices for the PBMs, that's what's really going to make a difference. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we've been doing a large survey with the Inflation Reduction Act and asking payers all sorts of questions about what they're going to be doing and how they're going to be acting in the future and how they think industry is going to move. And one of the things that we wanted to ask them is, how do they currently manage biosimilars? And we wanted to ask them what they're doing right now and what they think they're going to do in the future, because Amjevita was just launching when we did the survey. So this one right here, is asking you, how often are you going to put a prior authorization requirement in for a patient using a biosimilar? And you're going to see very prevalent, right? Just in general, these are high cost products. You're going to see people trying to manage the use of them and making sure they're not being overly prescribed. But I think this next one right here really hits on that question too, is step therapy. You see here that there's quite a mix of the feeling of the PBM of what are we going to do to put a patient on the lower cost biosimilar. And the reason is again, that whole net price and where they get their rebates. And Humira is known in industry as a pretty highly rebated product. You're going to see these companies come in and evaluate them and say, yeah, but I'm still getting at the net at the end of the day, a better payout with the branded product, if that's the way we continue moving along in our system. So because of that, you often will see something where there will be a step through the brand. Or we've even seen with Amjevita some notes about a step through the more expensive WAC listed price with the bigger rebate for the patient to get to the lower price biosimilar or the biosimilar. Because at the end of the day, again, net is where it counts for a lot of the PBMs. Next slide, please. And I'm trying to talk really quickly because I know we're running out of time here. But where and what is Amjevita doing? And as Julie had mentioned earlier, they are coming in with those 2 cost thresholds, as Semglee did. It's something that we've seen that biosimilar manufacturers are feeling is necessary because they want to offer a low cost option to patients who need it. But then they also know that there is a game that we play in the pharmaceutical world. You can't deny that that's happening, that the rebate is where it's at. So what we've seen in looking at utilization is we've seen about a 12% drop in our data. We have a huge claims data repository here that we check like weekly to see what's going on with Amjevita. We've seen about a 12% drop in Humira utilization overall. And this could be people switching or new starts, but just the mix of what's going on in the country here with the availability of this product has changed. And if you look at the high versus low WAC, you see it's really going to that high WAC product. So most payers are obviously picking up the high cost, high rebate Amjevita because that's giving them at the end of the day that net discount that they're hoping to see. So, there's a lot of pressure in Congress right now on PBMs. There's a lot going on at the FTC right now. Is this going to change? Are we going to see the potential here? Absolutely. I think these price thresholds coming with 2 different thresholds might be a temporary Band-Aid tactic. But hopefully 4 to 5 years from now, we're going to be in a more transparent system where those types of things don't have to happen. One can hope. But that's definitely a concern here as you see this, because at the end of the day, in Part D, with the Inflation Reduction Act, patients will hit a $2,000 cap no matter what for the drug, right? But you still have this full privately insured. You have people who are uninsured still and people losing their Medicaid coverage. What are their options for them to get cost effective products? Next, please. So what we asked to with the Inflation Reduction Act, we were talking with the payers and we said, hey, do you think that this is really going to put you in a place with putting preferential payment policies in place? And I think, and this shows again, the jury's out. They're all saying, we don't know. I mean, at the end of the day, some say, yeah, it could be great. We could really put ourselves out there and covering these products more. Others are, net prices is where they're at and they're not seeing it yet. So I think this again, just shows a lot of uncertainty, because when you see a chart like this and you can't pick a couple boxes and colors that come together in a good way, that no one else knows what's going on as well. So I think we're going to see some huge shifts in this industry overall. I think the Inflation Reduction Act, the Part D redesign and all of that, and also for biosimilar products. So I can stop there. I think that was the last one anyways. And
that was great, Amanda. And I think that we had one question in the chat about how is IRA going to affect all of this for all of the presenters. I think you really touched on that at the perfect moment in time for the audience. I want to, we have 1 minute left. Do any of the other presenters want to speak to that question about the impact of IRA on all of this? I see.
Want me to take it, everybody? You're just all jumping at it. Well, listen, I will tell you, if we had done more as a country to support biosimilar uptake and access and free market competition, maybe there wouldn't be an IRA because we wouldn't have to resort to direct negotiation. So I think we always as a country should be supporting free market competition. And I think the IRA will have impact across the board on access to innovation and to lower cost medicines. But again, I think it's a great way to remind ourselves that let's have competition and free market competition in this country as a way to lower cost. So
well,
I could go on.
Thank you for that, Julie. I know that could open up a lot of another hour's worth of discussion,
yeah.
But I really appreciate you bringing it to that simple point that, we are an economy and a society based on free market principles, and when we kind of get out of the way, it can work pretty well.
Yeah, let's all support it. That's what we need. We need support for free market competition.
Well, somebody's asking where the Arthritis Foundation Guide to Biosimilars is located. We can make sure that we send a link out on that with with the follow-up with the slides. Somebody else was asking, I know about the slides. Those will be available to everybody who was here today. We have you in the registration system and we'll send that to you. We're delighted that so many of you joined us. I couldn't be more grateful to our presenters who really just in a very succinct way and in a brief time, I think really just raised my dial on understanding this environment. And I'm going to guess that's the same for others as well. So thank you all for being here. I'm sure you're jumping onto your 3 o'clocks because we're all scheduled back to back these days, but expect to hear from us with the slides and information. And thank you again to our wonderful presenters.